Welcome to a deep dive. Today we're tackling something really fundamental, something core to making sense of the world around you. Think about it, like trying to understand society without knowing how the pieces fit, or what the symbols mean. We've pulled together a stack of sources here, some book excerpts, a presentation overview you shared, all focused on the core ideas sociologists use to see the patterns shaping our lives.
That's right. And our mission, basically, in this deep dive is to unpack three of the most sort of foundational ways sociologists look at the social world.
Yeah.
Think of them like different pairs of glasses you can put on.
Different lenses, okay.
Exactly. Each pair helps you focus on something specific, maybe power, maybe stability, maybe everyday interactions, things you might totally miss otherwise. By the end, you'll have some hopefully powerful new lenses to use for looking at your campus or, global events.
And we're not just going to list definitions. We want to explore these major perspectives. Conflict theory, functionalism, symbolic interactionism, meet some of the thinkers behind them, and really importantly, connect their ideas to things you actually encounter, like navigating social media, understanding campus dynamics, thinking about how schools or even the justice system works.
It's about moving past just seeing what's happening to understanding why it's happening. Why is there inequality? What holds society together? How do our small chats actually build the world we live in? These perspectives offer different ways to answer those questions. Okay, let's dig into these sources, see what we find.
All right, let's start with that first pair of glasses, conflict theory. What's the core idea this lens wants us to focus on?
At its heart, conflict theory pushes us to look at power and inequality and how those things drive social change. So instead of seeing society as this, smooth running machine, it sees it more as a landscape where different groups are constantly competing.
Competing for what? Resources?
Yes, limited resources. That could be money, property, but also things like power itself, prestige, influence, even access to opportunities. And this unequal distribution, it creates tension, conflict really, between the groups with power, the dominant ones, and the groups with less, the subordinate ones.
So it's about figuring out who's got the power, who doesn't, and how that imbalance creates friction and shapes things.
Exactly. And the sources, they really point to Karl Marx as a key historical figure here. He was writing back in the 19th century, watching industrial capitalism take off. And what he saw was this fundamental conflict between two main classes.
Okay.
The bourgeoisie, they own the means of production, the factories, the land, the capital. And the proletariat, the workers, they only had their labor to sell.
And Marx's argument was that the owners, the bourgeoisie, were exploiting the workers.
Precisely. He talked a lot about concepts like alienation, that feeling workers had of being sort of disconnected from their work, from what they made, from each other, even from their own potential, because their work felt controlled and meaningless.
That sounds pretty bleak.
It was a critical view. He also analyzed surplus value. That's the gap between what workers get paid and the actual value their labor creates for the owners. That extra value, the profit, the owners kept it, which led to wealth building up for some and poverty for others. Marx believed this core conflict, based on economics, was the engine driving social change. He actually predicted it would lead to a revolution. Workers overthrowing capitalism, creating communism, a classless society.
Right. And his famous quote, something about philosophers interpreting the world, but the point is to change it.
Exactly. The philosophers have only interpreted the world.
Yeah.
The point is to change it. It really captures that action-oriented side of conflict theory.
It sounds historical, maybe, but the sources definitely suggest these ideas are still, very relevant. They mention debates about income inequality, huge topic now in movements like Occupy Wall Street.
Absolutely. Those clearly tapped into ideas about wealth, imbalance, and power. And conflict isn't just about economics. That's important. The sources show how this lens applies elsewhere. Think about W.E.B. Du Bois. He used a conflict lens powerfully to understand race in America.
Okay, how so?
He saw racial conflict as central to U.S. society. And one of his most profound ideas was double consciousness.
Double consciousness. What does that mean exactly?
It's this idea that African Americans living in a society shaped by racial bias develop a kind of dual awareness. They have their identity as Americans, from their own experiences, but they also constantly see themselves through the lens of the dominant white society, often negatively. It creates this internal split, like always viewing yourself through others' critical eyes.
Wow.
Du Bois saw this clearly after the Civil War. Slavery was legally over, but prejudice created this persistent color line, a stark division in opportunities, rights, social standing between black and white people. He argued black people weren't owned by individuals anymore, but they became, in his words, slaves of society, because systemic racism denied them full freedom.
And his work on systemic racism, like in the justice system, that fits this conflict view.
Perfectly. It shows how power and inequality get embedded in the structures themselves, not just in individual attitudes.
That adds such a crucial layer. Now, the sources also bring in Michel Foucault here. How does he fit with conflict theory? His ideas about power seem different.
Foucault definitely expands how we think about power. Beyond just the state or the economy, he looks at how power operates everywhere, often in subtle ways, through relationships, institutions, even through knowledge itself. The sources mention his work on surveillance societal structures, including modern tech.
Like CCTV, or maybe how our online activity is tracked.
Yes, things like that. Foucault explored how these systems shape our behavior, our norms. He called it governmentality. He talked about disciplinary societies, where institutions encourage us to regulate ourselves based on societal expectations, often without obvious force.
How does that work?
Well, the sources give a really interesting example. Dieting, or the constant pursuit of a quote-unquote perfect body. Foucault might argue this isn't just personal choice, it's a disciplinary practice, shaped by mass media, cultural standards. People internalize these norms and police themselves, regulating their bodies based on external ideals, maybe not their own desires.
That's unsettling.
It can be. But here's the really interesting part, Foucault adds. While power structures can seem all-encompassing, he insisted that where there's power, there's always the possibility of resistance, of challenging those norms.
Okay, so conflict theory. It gives us this lens for seeing power struggles, inequality, friction. It feels like a very critical perspective.
It is. It's designed to critique the status quo, understand what keeps inequality going, and what leads to change.
Let's switch gears then. If conflict theory shows us the friction, what does functionalism show us? What's its picture?
Functionalism offers a very, very different view. Where conflict theory sees competition, functionalism sees cooperation, stability. This perspective views society as a complex system, kind of like a biological organism.
An organism, like a body.
Exactly, with different parts working together. These parts are our social institutions, family, education, religion, government, the economy. Each institution has specific functions, roles it performs, and these functions contribute to the overall health, the balance, the stability of the whole society.
So each part has a job, basically, and when they all do their job, society runs smoothly.
That's the core idea. Herbert Spencer, an early theorist, really pushed that organism analogy, seeing society's parts as interdependent, like organs. The sources give good examples. Schools. They function to teach skills, norms, prepare you for work and social roles. The family, especially in, say, older agrarian cultures, functioned as the main economic unit, plus raising kids, teaching values, religious institutions. They often provide community, shared beliefs, purpose. That reinforces social cohesion, especially in tough times.
And Auguste Comte comes in here, the guy who coined sociology.
Yes, Comte is foundational. He championed positivism, the idea that we could and should study society scientifically, like the natural sciences. His goal was to discover the laws of social order, so we could understand society better and maybe bring about positive reform, use science to build a more stable world. He lived through a lot of disruption, the French Revolution, industrialization, so that focus on order makes sense.
Right. And then Emile Durkheim, he's huge in functionalism. The sources mention social facts, collective consciousness, anomie. What was he focused on?
Durkheim was really trying to figure out what holds society together, especially as it modernized. He introduced the idea of social facts. These are ways of acting, thinking, feeling that exist outside any single person, but they shape our behavior. Think laws, customs, moral rules, even fashion trends. They're real, they're external to us, and you can study them. He saw them as proof that society is more than just individuals added up.
Like feeling pressure to follow certain norms, even if you didn't invent them.
Exactly that.
Ow.
He also talked about two kinds of social solidarity, or social glue. In simpler traditional societies, you had mechanical solidarity. Based on shared beliefs, shared experiences, people were similar, creating a strong collective consciousness, shared norms, binding everyone.
Okay.
But in modern industrial societies, with more complex division of labor, people doing specialized jobs, you get organic solidarity. This isn't based on being the same, but on being interdependent. We need each other because we do different things. The farmer needs the doctor, the teacher needs the tech expert. Mutual need creates the bond.
And his famous study on suicide, That fits here. Seems like an odd fit for a theory about stability.
It's actually a classic demonstration of his functionalist approach. Durkheim looked at suicide rates across different groups and found they weren't just random individual acts. They followed social patterns. He found rates were lower where social integration was strong, like among Catholics versus Protestants in his study, or during national crises when people pull together.
So connection matters.
Hugely. He argued that too little social integration, feeling disconnected, or a lack of clear norms, what he called anomie, a kind of normlessness, could lead to social problems, including higher suicide rates. His work powerfully shows the functionalist point. Strong social bonds, clear norms, institutions. They're vital for individuals and for society's health. As he put it, society is not a mere sum of individuals. The system formed by their association represents a specific reality. Functionalism helps us see how these parts contribute to order.
Okay, so we have conflict theory macro, focused on power, inequality. Functionalism also macro, focused on stability, institutions working together. Now, let's zoom right in to the micro level. Symbolic interactionism. What's a view like from down here?
Symbolic interactionism shifts the focus completely, away from big structures down to face-to-face, everyday interactions. This perspective is all about meaning, how people create it, maintain it, change it, through communication and through shared symbols.
So how we interpret things.
Yeah.
And build understanding through talking and interacting.
Exactly. And symbols are key. A symbol is just anything we attach meaning to. A word, a gesture, an object, an image. The meaning isn't in the symbol itself. It's created and shared socially. The sources have some good examples. Teacher smiles at a student during a test.
Right.
That smile, it's a symbol. To one student, it might mean encouragement. To another, maybe feeling stressed, it could feel like sarcasm. The meaning gets made in that interaction.
Like how a thumbs up means different things in different places or contexts.
Perfect example. Or think about nicknames or gestures within a specific group, like inmates in prison, the sources mention. They carry specific meanings, creating shared understanding there. Even on social media, likes, emojis, certain slang. They're all symbols. They shape how we see others, how we interact online.
That really helps understand things like TikTok trends, doesn't it? Those gestures and symbols create shared meanings very fast.
Absolutely. They build micro-communities through shared symbolic interaction. George Herbert Mead is a key figure here. He focused on how our self, our sense of who we are, actually develops through social interaction. We learn who we are based on how others see us and react to us.
And Erden Goffman, the sources mention him drawing heavily on this. What did he look at?
Goffman was fascinated by how we present ourselves in daily life.
Yeah.
He used a dramaturgical approach like we're actors on a stage, managing the impressions others form of us. The sources highlight his work on stigma.
Stigma.
He defined it not as something inherently bad about a person, but as an attribute that's deeply discrediting in a social context. It creates a gap between our virtual social identity, what society expects based on cues, and our actual identity, who we feel we are.
Like judging someone with a disability based on assumptions, maybe?
A very common example. The stigma isn't the disability itself, but the negative meaning society attaches to it through interaction. And power dynamics play a role. Who gets to define what's normal or discrediting? Goffman studied how people manage these spoiled identities. Maybe they try to hide the stigma, or maybe they strategically reveal it, or use humor. He also studied total institutions, prisons, asylums, places where people undergo mortification of the self. Their old identity, built through past interactions, gets stripped away. New clothes, maybe a number instead of a name. And a new identity gets imposed, based purely on their role in the institution. It shows just how much our sense of self depends on interaction and symbols, like uniforms, names, possessions.
That's incredibly insightful. How much of our identity is really social? Now, the sources also mention Max Weber here, his interpretive approach. How does he connect to symbolic interactionism? He seems more macro sometimes.
That's a great point. Weber kind of bridges macro and micro. While Marx and Durkheim focused on big structures to the economy, social facts, Weber was really interested in subjective understanding, what he called Verstehen interpretive understanding, and social actions.
Social actions?
Actions individuals take that are guided by the meaning they attach to them and that take others' actions into account. This focus on meaning-making, on individual interpretation, that aligns really well conceptually with symbolic interactionism's core ideas. He pushed back against pure positivism, arguing you can't just study society like physics, you have to understand the meanings people give to their own actions.
Trying to get inside someone's head, understand their perspective.
Essentially, yes. To understand why they act the way they do, his famous study on the Protestant work ethic and capitalism is an example. He argued certain religious ideas, specific meanings around hard work, saving, success, motivated people in ways that unintentionally helped capitalism develop. He showed how culture and ideas, the meanings people hold, could shape actions and have huge social consequences. So even looking at big changes, his focus on subjective meaning connects him to this micro-level perspective.
Wow. Okay. It's really clear how these three perspectives, conflict, functionalism, and symbolic interactionism, offer such, well, profoundly different ways of seeing the same social world.
They absolutely do. One lens highlights power, struggle, inequality. Another highlights stability, cooperation, how the parts work together. And the third zooms right in on our daily interactions, on how we build meaning and identity using symbols.
And they're not necessarily opposites, are they? Like you can use them together.
Definitely. They operate at different levels. Conflict and functionalism are generally seen as macro, looking at big structures. Symbolic interactionism is micro-focused on face-to-face stuff, but using all three gives you a much richer, more complete understanding. You get the big picture view and the close-up of how people actually experience and shape that picture every day. It reminds me of C. Wright Mills and his idea of the sociological imagination.
Yes, the sociological imagination, connecting personal lives to bigger social forces.
Exactly. Mills said it's crucial to connect our personal troubles, things like feeling stressed about grades or struggling to find a job, to public issues. Broader social patterns like how the education system works or economic trends. These sociological perspectives, they are the tools that help you make those connections. They help you see how your own story is linked to these larger patterns of power, stability, and meaning-making.
That really does change how you look at almost everything. A simple interaction, a TikTok trend, a major protest. It's not just what happens, but the layers underneath.
That's absolutely the goal. Once you understand these perspectives, you have this toolkit. You can analyze almost anything social megades. You encounter dynamics in your friend group, campus policies, media messages, social inequality from multiple angles. It adds depth.
It definitely gives you a much deeper appreciation for how complex the social world is, and maybe how much is usually hidden from view.
And I think importantly, it encourages you to ask better questions, more critical questions. Instead of just accepting things, you can ask, who benefits here? That's conflict theory. Or how does this contribute to social order? What function does it serve? Functionalism. Or what meanings are people creating and sharing in this interaction? How are identities being negotiated? Symbolic interactionism.
Those are really powerful questions to carry around. Thanks so much for walking us through this deep dive into these core perspectives.
My pleasure. Hopefully these lenses offer some genuinely new ways for you to see the world.
And just to leave you with something to think about, a provocative thought for your day, pick one social situation you're part of regularly, maybe a class, your job, even just scrolling through your favorite social media feed. Try looking at it first through the conflict lens, then functionalism, then symbolic interactionism. How does shifting those lenses change what you see and how you understand what's really going on there?